the first step forward. The bustling hum of the airport terminal surrounded the Carter family as they moved through the gleaming modern space. The voices of travelers blended with the soft clink of luggage wheels on the marble floor, and overhead, large windows bathed the terminal in natural light. At the forefront was Elijah Carter, a respected civil rights attorney, his strides confident yet deliberate. His gaze swept across the people around him, always observant, always aware. At his side was his wife, Maya, a leading sociologist whose books on racial inequality had sparked conversations in universities across the country. She carried herself with grace, a quiet force of intellect and passion. Their teenage daughter, Amina, walked beside them, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the luxurious surroundings. This wasn't just a trip for the Carters. It was more than a vacation. It was a much-needed break after years of relentless work and dedication to their causes. For Elijah, this was a rare opportunity to step away from the courtrooms and meetings, to spend uninterrupted time with his family. Maya, too, had dedicated years to her research, pushing for systemic change through education and policy reform. Now, the three of them were taking time to reconnect and enjoy each other's company, far from the weight of their daily responsibilities. They approached the first-class check-in counter, and Amina, who had been almost buzzing with excitement, suddenly fell silent. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in the upscale passengers lounging comfortably with their elegant attire and pristine grooming. She had never traveled in such luxury before, and the sight of it made her feel both elated and a little out of place. Her mother noticed her daughter's discomfort and placed a hand gently on Amina's shoulder. "You're nervous, aren't you?" Maya asked softly. Amina gave a small, sheepish smile. "Just a little. This is a lot." Elijah chuckled, his deep voice carrying a warmth that immediately reassured his daughter. "There's no need to worry, Amina. We belong here just as much as anyone else." But as they reached the counter, Elijah couldn't help but notice a pair of eyes locked onto them. A woman standing by the counter, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, looked at the Carters with an air of disbelief. Her expression shifted from confusion to irritation as she glanced between Elijah, Maya, and Amina. Without a word, she stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and demanding. "This is the first-class check-in. I think you've made a mistake." Elijah's calm demeanor never wavered, but he could feel the tension building in the air. Maya stepped forward, her own expression cool and composed, but Amina could see the muscle in her mother's jaw tighten. "We're in the right line," Elijah replied smoothly, though the woman's words lingered like a stinging reminder of the prejudice they often faced in spaces like this. He wasn't sure what the woman's problem was, whether it was their appearance, their presence in this area, or something deeper, but he could sense that this encounter was about to escalate. The woman's eyes narrowed. "I don't think you understand. I'm asking you to move. You're disrupting the flow of the line, and frankly, I don't believe you belong here." Amina's heart raced. She had heard stories of how people like them were often made to feel unwelcome in places where they were not expected. But this felt different. It felt personal. "Excuse me?" Maya's voice was low but firm. She stepped closer, positioning herself between the woman and her daughter. "We are exactly where we're supposed to be." The woman hesitated, clearly taken aback by Maya's calm but assertive tone. But then her gaze flicked to Elijah, sizing him up. "This is a first-class line, sir. Not for people like you." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. He had been in far more tense situations before, courtrooms, protests, negotiations, and this was no different. He wasn't going to let this woman's ignorance disrupt their moment. He looked directly into her eyes, his voice steady and unwavering. "People like me?" he asked, his tone cool but carrying the weight of years spent fighting for justice. "I think you might be confusing us with someone else. We're first-class passengers, just like the rest of them." Amina, feeling a mixture of shame and anger, turned to her father. She had seen this happen before in small ways, in the subtle glances or the way people moved when they saw her family walking into certain spaces. But this was something different. It was as if the woman had taken it upon herself to act as a gatekeeper, to decide who was worthy of being in this space. The woman's cheeks flushed red as she stammered, clearly caught off guard by Elijah's response. I didn't mean. You didn't think, Maya interjected smoothly. You assumed, and now you're making a scene. You're not the first to do so, but you will be the last. At that moment, the check-in agent behind the counter, who had been watching the exchange in silence, cleared her throat. Her expression was sympathetic, but there was a firmness in her voice that made it clear she wasn't going to tolerate any more of this behavior. I believe there's been some misunderstanding, the agent said, her eyes flicking briefly to the woman who had confronted the Carters. Mr. Carter, your reservation is confirmed. You and your family are cleared to proceed. The woman's face fell, and she stepped back, her cheeks still burning with embarrassment. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, but then seemed to think better of it and quickly walked away, leaving the Carters standing in the silence of the terminal. Amina let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Dad, Mom, that was amazing. I don't know how you stayed so calm. Elijah smiled, ruffling her hair. It's not always easy, but it's what we have to do. Sometimes, you can't let other people's ignorance define who you are. Maya placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes softening. What's important is that we know who we are. We don't need anyone else to tell us. As they moved to the next step in their journey, the weight of the encounter lingered, but the Carters' resolve only grew stronger. This wasn't just a trip for relaxation, it was a reminder that their work, their values, and their commitment to justice were with them wherever they went. And as they walked away from the check-in counter, they didn't just leave behind an unpleasant encounter. They left behind a statement: no one could define their worth but themselves. The flight. The flight was smooth and uneventful, but the Carters were far from relaxed. Elijah and Maya sat side by side, their hands touching lightly between them, exchanging quiet words here and there. Amina, on the other hand, found herself staring out the window, her mind spinning as the world below became a patchwork of clouds and patches of land. Her emotions were still in a swirl after the encounter at the airport, and the distance from the city wasn't offering the escape she had hoped for. The hum of the airplane's engines was soothing in its own way, but it couldn't drown out the thoughts racing in Amina's head. She had expected some discomfort, maybe even a few sideways glances, but what had happened at the airport had shaken her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the woman's assumptions or the way she treated them, it was the realization that despite all the progress, despite the accolades and degrees and recognition her parents had earned, there were still people who saw them as less than. And worse, Amina knew that the same assumptions would likely follow them in this new space, on the plane, in the hotel, in any city they visited. Was there any place left where people like her family could simply exist without having to constantly prove they belonged? She felt the familiar sting of frustration rising in her chest. It wasn't fair. They worked so hard, made so many sacrifices to get to this point, only to have their worth questioned by someone who had no idea who they were. Amina turned toward her father, whose gaze was focused ahead, deep in thought. He had an aura of calm, an ability to stay grounded even in the face of adversity. But Amina could see the weariness in his eyes, the way the weight of his career, the constant battle for justice, was etched into his features. "Dad?" Amina asked, her voice quiet but filled with the weight of unspoken questions. "Do you ever get tired of fighting?" Elijah didn't look at her immediately. He took a long breath, his fingers resting lightly on the armrest. "Tired?" "Yes, sometimes. It's exhausting to constantly have to fight for something that should just be a given. To have to prove again and again that we deserve to be here, that we matter." He finally turned toward her, meeting her gaze. But here's the thing, Amina, every battle, no matter how tiring, is a step towards something better. It's not about us always being right, it's about creating a world where the next generation doesn't have to fight these same battles. Where people don't have to prove their worth based on their skin or where they come from. Maya leaned in from the seat beside them, her voice warm with understanding. Your father's right. Every fight, every challenge, is part of a bigger picture. The world may not change overnight, but that doesn't mean it won't change. We're not just fighting for us, we're fighting for everyone who comes after us. Amina nodded slowly, absorbing her parents' words. She understood, of course, but it was hard. It was hard to feel like she was constantly swimming against a tide that wasn't interested in changing its course. The world was big, and even if they did their part, it still felt like a tiny drop in the ocean. As the plane ascended higher, climbing through layers of cloud, Amina felt a strange stillness settle over her. It was the kind of calm that only comes from distance, the space between the noise of the world below and the peace of a sky unbroken by the demands of everyday life. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment, and let herself feel the quiet that surrounded her. When she opened her eyes again, she was met with her mother's gaze, steady and unwavering. Maya had been quietly observing her for some time, and now, seeing the question in her daughter's eyes, she spoke again. Are you okay, Amina? She asked gently. I don't know, Amina replied, her voice laced with uncertainty. I feel like there's so much weight on me, on us. I want to believe in the work you and Dad are doing. I know it's important. But it feels like no matter how much you do, there are always people who won't see us. Who won't see me. Sometimes, it just feels like we're invisible. Maya reached over, pulling Amina into a tight embrace. I understand, she whispered. But you are far from invisible. And the work we do is not about being seen by everyone, it's about making a difference, no matter how small. Every time you stand up, every time you walk into a room with your head held high, you are making an impact. Even if you can't see it. Elijah leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. The truth is, Amina, the world is always going to have people who try to hold us down. But the strength to rise up isn't in the world around us. It's within us. It's in how we choose to respond to those moments, how we choose to use our voices and our actions to create change. And trust me, change is happening. It's slow, and sometimes it's painful, but it's happening. Amina absorbed her parents' words, feeling their warmth and conviction wrap around her like a protective shield. They had always been her anchors, her source of strength. It was easy to forget, in moments of doubt, how much they had already accomplished, and how much more they would accomplish in the future. As the flight continued, Amina drifted in and out of sleep, the weight of the world gradually lifting off her shoulders. She woke several hours later, the soft glow of the cabin lights casting a gentle hue over her parents' faces. She noticed that her father had pulled out a small notebook and was scribbling something in it, his brow furrowed in concentration. He always had a notebook with him, always writing down thoughts or ideas that came to him during quiet moments like this. Dad, Amina whispered, nudging him gently. Elijah looked up, startled for a moment, before a smile broke across his face. Did I wake you? Amina shook her head, her voice thoughtful. What are you writing? You always have that notebook with you. Elijah chuckled softly, flipping the notebook around so she could see. Notes, ideas, thoughts for cases I'm working on. It's not just about law, though. I write down everything, my thoughts on the future, on where we need to go as a society. And sometimes, I write about you and your mom. You both inspire me every single day. Amina smiled, touched by his words. It was moments like this, moments where the real-world weight of injustice and inequality could be momentarily set aside, that she felt the depth of her parents' commitment. It wasn't just about fighting for the rights of others, it was about creating a legacy for their family, for everyone who would come after them. As the flight moved closer to its destination, Amina felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer overwhelmed by the obstacles. Instead, she saw them as opportunities to continue her parents' work, to carry forward the legacy of resistance, and to ensure that her voice, and the voices of those like her, were heard. New beginnings, old struggles. The airplane finally touched down, its wheels screeching lightly against the smooth tarmac as the plane slowed to a halt. The Carters unbuckled their seatbelts, the low hum of the engine winding down as the cabin lights flickered back on. Amina stretched, her body stiff from the long flight, and glanced out the window. The city was sprawling beneath them, a mixture of high-rise buildings and lush greenery, with a landscape dotted by rivers and roads that led to parts of the world unknown to her. They had arrived. Elijah, Maya, and Amina gathered their belongings and walked through the gate, each step carrying them further from the familiar comfort of their home and closer to what they hoped would be an opportunity to recharge, to rediscover themselves, and perhaps, to confront new challenges. As they moved through the airport, Amina noticed the difference in the air, the subtle shift from the cold, sterile atmosphere of the U.S. to a more relaxed, open-feeling environment. People here moved differently, there was less hurry, less judgment. It felt different. It felt like a new beginning, or at least the promise of one. Despite this, Amina's mind was still heavy. The encounter at the airport in the U.S. had thrown her off course, and she couldn't shake the thought of how she had been treated by someone who, in the grand scheme of things, had no right to question her place in the world. It wasn't just about the woman's judgment. Amina was beginning to realize that it was about a much deeper, more ingrained issue, that people like her would always have to prove themselves, no matter where they went. As they reached the baggage claim, Elijah turned to his family, his eyes thoughtful. "Let's not let that energy follow us here. We're on vacation, remember? This is about us recharging, finding peace, and resetting our minds. We have to leave the battles behind for now. We'll fight them when we get home." Amina nodded, her resolve firming a little with each passing moment. Her father was right. There was always work to be done, always another fight around the corner, but this was their time. This was about them as a family, away from the weight of their everyday battles. She could do this. She could enjoy this moment. They grabbed their bags, and after a brief stop at the customs counter, they made their way out into the terminal. The air was warmer, carrying with it the promise of a place where time slowed down, where the pressures of everyday life could be put on pause. Amina found herself breathing a little more easily, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. As they walked outside to the waiting taxi, the bustling noise of the city filled the air, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was simply the sound of people going about their daily lives, chatting in a language Amina didn't understand but which felt like a comforting hum in the background. Their driver, a middle-aged man with dark eyes and a friendly smile, greeted them with warmth, and soon they were whisked away into the heart of the city. The ride to their hotel was filled with curious stares from Amina, who couldn't help but take in every corner of this unfamiliar world. The streets were alive with color, bright signs in different languages, vendors selling fruits and goods on every corner, children running and laughing in the streets. It was a world apart from the one she had left behind. And yet, it was full of the same energy, the same life force that flowed through every city, through every culture, through every people. When they arrived at the hotel, a beautiful high-rise with sweeping views of the city skyline, Amina was struck by how different the space felt from the cold, impersonal hotels they'd stayed in before. This was a place that embraced its heritage, its history. From the intricate designs on the lobby walls to the delicate scent of jasmine flowers in the air, it felt alive with stories waiting to be told. The bellhop, a young man with a warm smile, led them to their room on the 10th floor. The suite was spacious and tastefully furnished, with plush chairs and a bed that looked inviting after the long flight. But it wasn't the luxury of the room that caught Amina's attention, it was the view. Through the large windows, the city stretched out before them, an endless maze of lights, buildings, and the faint murmur of distant voices. It was mesmerizing. For a moment, she stood there in awe, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. "This is amazing," Amina whispered, as her parents unpacked their things, the weight of their journey momentarily lifted by the serenity of the view. Maya walked up beside her, placing a hand on Amina's shoulder. "It is, isn't it? Sometimes, you just need to step away from everything, take a breath, and let the world show you something beautiful." Elijah stood behind them, glancing out the window. "This is what we need. Space. Time. To remind ourselves of why we do the work we do. Not because the world makes it easy, but because it's worth it." Amina turned back to face her parents. Their words were comforting, grounding her in the present moment. The struggles of yesterday, the ignorance they'd faced, the battles they fought, felt distant now, like they belonged to another time, another place. Perhaps the key wasn't in constantly battling against the forces that sought to keep them down, perhaps it was in finding peace, in creating spaces like this where they could rest, regroup, and find their center once again. As they settled in, Amina found herself relaxing. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't worried about what people might think of her or her family. She wasn't concerned about the battles ahead, about the obstacles that would no doubt rise again once they returned home. For now, she was content to simply be. To experience this new place and see it for all the beauty it held. That evening, they ventured out into the city to explore. The streets were alive with music, the air thick with the scent of spices and grilled meats from street vendors. The laughter of families and the chatter of market stalls filled the air as they wandered through the busy squares. Amina felt the city wrap itself around her like a warm embrace, each corner offering something new, something beautiful, something different. As they walked, Amina found herself lost in the rhythm of the city, in the energy that pulsed through every street, every person, every movement. She realized that this was what it meant to truly connect, to be present, to experience the world in its raw, unfiltered form. There were no pretenses here, no assumptions about who she was or where she came from. There was only the joy of the moment, the simple pleasure of existing in this space, with these people, in this time. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Amina felt free. The unexpected encounter. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm golden glow across the room. Amina awoke to the sound of birds calling from the trees outside, the city still sleepy in the early hours of the day. She stretched lazily, her limbs still tired from the excitement of yesterday, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air today, a promise that something new awaited. She glanced over at her parents, who were already up. Elijah was sitting at the desk, his notebook open in front of him, scribbling notes with a focused expression. Maya, ever the early riser, was standing by the window, gazing out at the city with a cup of tea in hand. There was an unspoken understanding between the three of them, a shared knowledge that this trip wasn't just a vacation, it was also a chance for all of them to reconnect. To recharge. To push the boundaries of their own understanding. "Good morning," Amina said, her voice still heavy with sleep but soft and warm. "Good morning, honey," Maya responded, turning from the window with a smile. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Amina replied, sitting up in bed. "It's quiet here, peaceful. I feel like I can think clearly for the first time in a while." Elijah glanced up from his notebook, his face lighting up with a brief smile. "It's good to hear that. Sometimes the mind needs space to breathe. The world is so full of noise, it's easy to forget how loud it can be until it's gone." Amina nodded, her eyes thoughtful. The noise of everyday life, the grind of school, the demands of her parents' careers, the constant battle against ignorance and prejudice, had worn her down. This trip had already begun to peel away the layers of stress she'd built up over the years. In this city, she could almost hear herself again. And that was a gift she didn't take lightly. After breakfast, the family decided to spend the day exploring a nearby cultural center, a sprawling museum dedicated to the region's history and art. The moment they stepped inside, Amina felt the weight of history pressing on her. The walls were lined with beautiful paintings and sculptures depicting the stories of the people who had lived here long before the modern world had taken shape. There were intricate depictions of battles, stories of love and loss, of triumph and struggle. As they wandered through the exhibits, Amina found herself drawn to a particular section. It was dedicated to the civil rights movements that had taken place in this part of the world, chronicling the heroes and leaders who had fought for freedom, equality, and justice. It was a stark reminder of how interconnected the struggles for justice were across the world. The faces of those who had fought for their own people seemed to watch her as she read through their stories, their eyes filled with determination and defiance. She couldn't help but feel a deep connection to them. "This is incredible," Amina whispered, turning to her mother. "I didn't know how much I needed to see this until now." Maya smiled softly, her hand resting on Amina's shoulder. "History has a way of finding us, no matter where we are. Sometimes we don't realize how much of it is still alive in us until we see it reflected back." As they continued their tour, they found themselves in a smaller gallery at the back of the museum. The space was quiet, and the lighting was dim, as if the room held a secret that only a few were meant to uncover. The paintings here were different, abstract and modern, but with an undeniable depth. Each piece seemed to speak to the struggles of identity and belonging, of finding one's place in a world that was constantly shifting. Amina stopped in front of one painting in particular. It was a striking image of a woman standing tall, her posture powerful, yet there was a sadness in her eyes. The artist had captured a sense of inner strength, mixed with the sorrow of carrying a burden no one could see. It reminded Amina of the weight her own family had carried, the pressure of being in a constant state of otherness, of always fighting to be heard. "Isn't she beautiful?" Amina said, her voice almost reverent as she continued to study the painting. Maya joined her, her gaze following her daughter's. "She is. And I think that's the point of this whole exhibit. The struggle doesn't just come from the outside, it comes from within. We fight not only for justice but to preserve our humanity in a world that often tries to strip it away." Amina nodded slowly, her thoughts consumed by the artist's portrayal of struggle. "It's hard sometimes, you know. To hold on to who you are when the world seems determined to tear you apart." Elijah approached them then, his hands in his pockets. "The fight is never just about the world around us. It's also about the world inside us. The world we choose to create, to nurture, to preserve. And sometimes, that means we must carry those burdens for a while. But we carry them together." Amina smiled at her father, her heart swelling with pride. She knew that her parents had been carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders for years, but they had never let it break them. And now, in this moment, she realized something important. The strength they carried wasn't just for themselves, it was for her too. As the afternoon passed, they continued to explore the museum, absorbing the history and art that surrounded them. They lost track of time, the hours slipping by unnoticed until the museum's closing announcement echoed through the halls. "We should head back to the hotel," Elijah suggested, glancing at his watch. "It's been a long day." As they made their way toward the exit, Amina's thoughts drifted back to the painting. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to tell her something, that it was speaking to a part of her she hadn't fully understood yet. But before she could reflect further, she was pulled from her thoughts by a sudden voice. "Amina?" She turned, startled to hear her name. Standing near the entrance of the gallery was a woman, her hair styled in soft curls, dressed in a flowing green dress. She had a look of recognition in her eyes, her face lighting up with surprise and excitement. "Amina Carter? Is that really you?" Amina blinked, taken aback. "Yes, that's me. I don't believe we've met." The woman's face softened with a knowing smile. It's me, Layla. We met a few years ago, at the International Symposium on Social Justice in New York. I'm Layla Hassan. We were both on the same panel about racial identity. Amina's mind raced, trying to recall the event. Then, it clicked. Layla. The woman who had spoken so passionately about the intersection of race and culture, about the importance of representation in global leadership. Amina had admired her from afar back then. I remember now. Amina exclaimed, a smile crossing her face. It's so good to see you. How have you been? Layla's face broke into a bright grin. I'm doing well, thank you. I didn't expect to run into you here, of all places. But I guess the universe has a way of bringing people together when they least expect it. The two women shared a warm handshake, and Layla turned to Amina's parents, greeting them with respect and familiarity. I've heard so much about your work, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. It's an honor to meet you both in person. Elijah and Maya exchanged a knowing glance, pleased by the recognition. They had encountered their fair share of colleagues and peers, but meeting Layla here, in this space, felt like a serendipitous moment of connection. Amina could see the warmth in her parents' eyes as they interacted with Layla, and she felt the familiar rush of pride that always came when her family's work was acknowledged by others who shared their passion for change. After some more conversation, Layla invited them to dinner, an offer they gladly accepted. As the evening unfolded, the Carters and Layla found themselves delving deep into conversations about race, culture, and the global fight for justice. Amina felt something shift within her during that dinner, a sense of hope, of solidarity, and a reminder that despite all the challenges they faced, they were not alone in their journey. Unforeseen connections. The next few days seemed to blur together as Amina and her family settled into a rhythm in the vibrant city. Their days were filled with new experiences, visiting local markets, exploring hidden corners of the city, and soaking in the rich history and culture of the region. Yet, despite all the beauty and adventure, a lingering question hovered in Amina's mind. How much of the world's problems could truly be solved by a single individual? Was change something that could be attained just through knowledge and effort? Or was it more about coming together in unexpected ways, uniting people across the world with a shared goal? That question haunted her as they ventured to a secluded part of the city, known for its bustling street art scene. Murals, graffiti, and bold expressions of color covered every wall, each piece telling its own story of struggle, joy, and rebellion. The streets here were alive with an energy unlike any Amina had ever witnessed. Young artists painted, musicians played, and voices echoed with the sound of revolution. It was a reminder that art was a universal language, capable of transcending boundaries and speaking directly to the heart. Amina's curiosity was piqued as she walked through this artistic maze. She noticed how the streets themselves seemed to vibrate with a force of their own, as if the walls held not only paint but the hopes and dreams of generations. There was a feeling of freedom here, a sense of rebellion against the status quo. Amina found herself caught between the vibrant murals, her thoughts churning with a mix of awe and discomfort. The rawness of the artwork spoke of struggles she knew all too well, but it also reminded her of how much the world still had to change. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with deep oranges and purples, Amina found herself standing in front of a particular mural. It was the image of a woman, strong and resolute, her face etched with determination. But what caught Amina's eye was the phrase written below it in bold, sweeping letters, "We rise by lifting each other." The words resonated deeply within her. She had always been told that change began with the individual. But now, as she stood before this powerful image, she wondered if it wasn't about the individual at all. Perhaps it was about the collective, the strength of the community, the power of solidarity. Amina? Her mother's voice broke through her reverie, drawing her attention back to reality. Maya stood beside her, watching her with a thoughtful expression. "What do you think? Does it speak to you?" Amina blinked, taking a deep breath as she nodded. Yeah. I think I've been looking at things the wrong way. Maybe it's not about fighting alone or constantly proving our worth. Maybe the real strength comes from lifting each other up. Maya smiled warmly, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. I think that's exactly what the artist is trying to tell us. Strength doesn't come from isolation, but from unity. From community. We fight together, not apart. The word settled into Amina's chest like a quiet storm. She had always believed that her family's struggles were isolated to them, that the injustices they faced were individual battles they had to overcome. But as she stood there, side by side with her mother, surrounded by this art, she began to realize that they were part of something much larger. A movement that spanned cultures, countries, and continents. As they continued to explore the street art, Amina's mind drifted back to the dinner they'd shared with Layla just a few days ago. The depth of their conversation had left a lasting impression on her. Layla's words had been powerful, inspiring even. She had spoken about the importance of bridging cultural divides, of forging connections between people who seemed worlds apart. And perhaps that was the missing piece in Amina's understanding. It wasn't enough to simply fight for justice in one place, in one country, or even in one life. Justice, true justice, had to be a global effort, a shared struggle that brought together people from every corner of the world. That's what Layla had been trying to tell her. It was what the murals were saying. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of thought. Amina barely spoke as she walked beside her parents, her mind racing. She had always known that the fight for equality was important, but the weight of it had always felt so personal, so heavy. She now understood that it wasn't just about her, or her family, or her community, it was about the world. That night, back in their hotel room, Amina lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet, the city's distant hum barely audible through the window. Elijah and Maya had already fallen asleep, the soft rise and fall of their breaths providing a soothing rhythm in the darkness. But Amina couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were too restless, too caught in the shifting currents of her realizations. The world felt larger now, more interconnected, more complicated. She no longer felt like an outsider in a foreign place. She felt connected to the people around her in a way she hadn't before, as if the walls that separated them were less important than the bonds that could unite them. As dawn approached, Amina finally closed her eyes, surrendering to the quiet pull of sleep. The lessons of the day would have to wait until tomorrow. But even in her slumber, her mind worked, processing everything she had seen and heard, the questions and insights that still lingered in the depths of her thoughts. The next morning, they decided to visit a local community center, a place that had become known for its work in supporting marginalized youth through education and mentorship. The center was tucked away in a quieter part of the city, surrounded by modest homes and small local businesses. The atmosphere was calm, but there was a palpable sense of purpose in the air. Amina's heart warmed as they toured the center, watching the staff interact with the children, teaching them skills, guiding them through their studies, and offering them a space to feel valued. These young people were not defined by their circumstances. They were filled with potential, with dreams of something greater. And in this space, they were given the tools they needed to rise above the challenges they faced. This, Amina said softly, turning to her parents, this is what it's all about. Not just changing the system, but empowering the people within it. Lifting each other up. Giving them the resources to rise. Elijah and Maya exchanged a proud look, their expressions both grateful and content. They had always believed in the power of education, the way it could transform individuals and entire communities. And now, Amina was seeing it with her own eyes, how the simple act of offering opportunity could create a ripple effect that carried through generations. As they left the center, Amina felt the shift inside her solidify. The struggle for equality, for justice, was never going to be easy. It was going to take time, effort, and an unwavering commitment. But it was also going to take love, compassion, and unity. The fight was not just about making noise, it was about making space for others to be heard. It was about lifting them up when they couldn't stand on their own. And as they walked back to the hotel, Amina's heart was full of hope, for herself, for her family, and for the world, the ties that bind. The next few days passed by in a blur of activity. Amina's thoughts were constantly shifting between the things she had learned during their stay in the city and the personal revelations she had begun to encounter. The words, "We rise by lifting each other," echoed in her mind constantly, a mantra she had begun to internalize. She found herself noticing little things, small acts of kindness and solidarity that previously might have gone unnoticed. It was as if the world had opened her eyes to a new way of seeing things. Amina knew her parents were seeing the change too. They no longer had to ask her how she was feeling, her quiet reflection said it all. But with these new insights came a new weight, the weight of the knowledge that change wasn't something that could be obtained quickly or easily. It was slow, deliberate, and sometimes frustrating. Justice was a marathon, not a sprint. It was a lesson that her parents had known all along, but it was something that Amina was just beginning to understand in the depth that only experience could provide. One afternoon, after a visit to a local school where Elijah had been invited to speak about human rights and social justice, the family gathered for a quiet lunch at a small cafe nestled in a corner of the city's bustling center. It was a peaceful place, far from the hustle and bustle of the larger tourist spots. Amina had chosen the spot herself. She had wanted somewhere that felt authentic, where they could feel like they were a part of the city rather than just visitors. The cafe was unassuming, with simple wooden tables, a small barista counter, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the air. It was here, in this quiet moment, that Amina found herself lost in thought again. The sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the table where her family sat, each of them immersed in conversation. Maya had just finished recounting a particularly engaging moment from Elijah's lecture, where the students had shared their own experiences with social justice. Elijah, for his part, was looking thoughtful, as though he were mentally processing the responses from the students and reflecting on the future of the fight for equality. But Amina was silent. She wasn't disconnected from the conversation, it was just that she felt there was something else she needed to understand, something more personal. Her mind kept drifting back to the concept of lifting each other up, and she wondered if there was a more tangible way to embody that idea. "Mom," Amina said suddenly, her voice cutting through the low hum of the cafe. "How do we really make a difference? I mean, we've been fighting for so long, but how do we know when we've actually made it?" Maya looked up from her coffee, her warm eyes meeting Amina's. "That's a question that many of us struggle with, sweetheart. How do we know when enough has been done? When will we have done enough to change things? The truth is, we might never know for sure. Sometimes, we don't get to see the full effect of our work, especially if the change is slow. But what if we don't see it at all?" Amina asked, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were voicing a fear she had long kept hidden. Maya took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "Then we keep going. You see, it's not about seeing the end of the road. It's about making sure that you're doing what you can, in whatever way you can, to leave the world better than you found it. You might not see the change you want, but someone else will benefit from your work. It's a long journey, Amina, but it's a journey that matters. And the lives we touch, even if it's just one person at a time, will carry that change forward." Amina thought about that for a long moment. She realized that she had been thinking too much in terms of an immediate, visible result, a conclusion that she could look back on and say, "We did it." But what her mother was telling her was that the change was more subtle than that. It wasn't just about victories that could be tallied or news stories that could be reported. It was about every conversation, every action, every step forward, no matter how small. Even if she couldn't see it, the change was happening. And in the long run, it was worth the effort. As they finished their meal, Amina felt a growing sense of clarity. She wasn't meant to carry the weight of the world on her own shoulders. It wasn't a solo endeavor, it was about collaboration. It was about creating a ripple that spread, far beyond her immediate sphere, and sometimes those ripples came from the most unexpected places. Elijah set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, joining the conversation. You know, Amina, when I was first starting out as a human rights lawyer, I thought the same thing. That we had to see the change, right then and there. I wanted results, tangible, quick results. But over time, I realized that real change often takes a lifetime. It's cumulative. It's the work that's done, bit by bit, that adds up. Amina nodded, absorbing his words. But don't you ever get discouraged? I mean, it's hard to see how far we've come when the world still seems so unjust. I do, Elijah admitted, his tone softer now, more reflective. There are days when the weight of it all feels too much to bear. But what keeps me going is knowing that I'm not alone. That there are others out there, like Layla, like you, who are fighting the same fight, each in their own way. Together, we form a movement that's bigger than any one person. That's what makes it powerful. Amina felt a warmth spread in her chest as she looked at her parents, at the bond they shared. Their commitment, their belief in the cause, was unwavering. And though she didn't have all the answers, she knew that the journey they were on was worth it. As the day wore on and they made their way back to the hotel, Amina's heart was full. The city had taught her so much, about history, about struggle, about the importance of standing up for what's right. But perhaps the most profound lesson of all had been the realization that change didn't always look the way she had imagined it. It wasn't always a big, sweeping victory. Sometimes, it was small, quiet, and slow. And that was enough. Back in the hotel room, Amina sat by the window, gazing out at the city as the sun set behind the skyline. She could feel the weight of the world lifting from her shoulders, replaced by a new sense of purpose. The fight was far from over. But she was no longer afraid of the journey ahead. For the first time in a long time, she felt ready to continue. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new challenges. But it would also bring new opportunities to connect, to learn, and to lift others up, just as she had been lifted.